Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. We're just going to give folks a couple minutes here to get signed in and settled, and then we will get started with the presentation. I'll take this moment to let you know that we are recording tonight's session so that we can share it on Island's 2050 webpage afterwards, so that anybody who may not have been able to make it tonight will have a chance to view the Q&A. And I'll be back on in a couple of minutes here, just when we're ready to get started. Hello again, everyone. I think people are going to keep filtering in as we go here, so we're going to get started. A reminder that we are recording tonight's session so that we can share it on the Island's 2050 webpage. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Peter Luckham, who is the chair of Islands Trust Council, and he is going to start us off. Oh, Peter, you're muted.
There's always somebody in the crowd. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here for the Islands 2015 virtual webinar. We're delighted to be launching this third phase, the Islands 2050 public engagement process. Before we get started this evening, it's my honor to introduce Hereditary Chief Bill Williams to open us up in a good way today.
Oscar Quail, Queen's North, the Lawson Keynes, I'd like to thank Islands Trust for the acknowledgement of protocol for all the 30 tribes and the 5 allied tribes in the Coast Salish Sea that the Island Trust has some responsibility over their traditional lands. We'd like to ask the Creator to put a special blessing on everybody who's online here to make sure that the obligation of Islands Trust is taken care of in the best way possible. I'd like to put a special blessing on all the children of all the people, of all the kids that are living on all the islands to make sure that they recognize where they are in how they continue to grow in the traditional lands of the Coast Salish tribes. We'd like to put a special blessing on each and every one of you to make sure that you're all healthy and safe. And this pandemic that is going around the world will not affect you as individuals or your family members. So you don't have to worry about the pandemic that is going around. We hope that everybody keeps safe and looks after yourself, and to make sure you look after your family in the best way possible. Thank you for this blessed day today. Hoi chika.
Hi, Chief Williams. Thank you. It's an honor for us to have you join us, and thank you very much for the blessing and consideration of our children and families. And all of my best wishes go out to you and your family. And thank you. Indeed, it's an honor for me to wake up every day here in Coast Salish territory. I live on Thetis Island, elected here, and that's Penelakut and Laxon territory. And all of us are meeting widely across the Coast Salish territory today. And it's a beautiful place to wake up to every day that is rich in culture and history, available for all of us to explore. And I encourage you all to explore that history and culture that has been here since the beginning of time. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Christy.
Thank you, Chief Bill Williams and Trustee Luckham, and thank you to everybody who is at home or wherever you may be for attending this evening's session. Tonight, we are hosting this event to walk you through some information and answer some questions that you may have related to this third phase of Islands 2050 public engagement on the draft new Islands Trust Policy Statement. We'll start off our presentation this evening with some information about the Islands Trust and its mandate, the policy statement and why it's being updated, highlights of some of the key draft amendments, as well as project timelines. Finally, we'll move into a question and answer session where our project team members and panelists will answer your questions. I'd like to take this moment to introduce you to some of the people you're here from tonight and the team working on the back end of tonight's event. We have multiple team members from both Islands Trust and ISL and attending this evening's Q&A session, who I'd like to introduce before we get started. Panelists and team, if you could turn on your cameras and wave when I read your name, that would be great. From the Islands Trust team, we have Peter Luckham, Chair of Islands Trust Council and local trustee on Thetis Island. We have Deb Morrison, Chair of the Trust Programs Committee and local trustee on North Pender Island. David Marler, Director of Local Planning Services, and Delani Hippola, Senior Policy Advisor. This team will be here to help you answer your questions about the project. Not on screen with us, but working hard behind the scenes to support tonight's event. Also from the Islands Trust, we have Jillian Nickel, Engagement Planner, and Claire Frater, Director of Trust Area Services. From ISL, we have myself. My name is Kirsty. You saw me a little bit earlier as we were getting started. In addition to myself, we have several ISL team members helping out behind the scenes, working hard to organize all of your questions as they come in. Andrea is working tirelessly in the background to make sure that you can see on screen all the good stuff. And we have Ashleen and Jennifer and Courtney, and the three of them are working, coordinating on the back end to make sure that we address all of the questions that come in tonight. And on that note, we will talk about how to submit questions. So team, if you want to turn your cameras back off, I'll talk a little bit about that. Throughout the session, all the way throughout the session, even during the presentation, you'll be able to submit questions through the Q&A tool, which is located on the lower menu bar of your screen. If you can't see that menu bar, give your mouse a wiggle or touch your screen and it should pop up for you. Our backstage team, as mentioned, receives your question and we make sure it's included in the Q&A session following the presentation. We are going to do our best tonight to get through as many questions as we can. Many of you pre-submitted your questions and we thank you for that. And we anticipate there will be more questions being submitted throughout the session tonight. Just a note that if questions are of a similar nature or on a similar topic, we may consolidate them or combine them. Again, this is in order to address as many possible questions as we can tonight. If there are questions that we cannot get to this evening, we'll be posting a document of the questions and answers next week on the project webpage, where we will also be posting a recording of tonight's session for those who were unable to attend this evening. That said, I will now pass the presentation over to Delani, who is going to walk us through some of the project information. Delani.
Thank you, Kirsty, and good evening, everyone. I'll be giving you a bit of an overview of the Policy Statement Amendment project. And it all starts here with the Islands Trust Act and what has come to be known formally as the Islands Trust Object. Islands Trust has a very special and unique provincial mandate to preserve and protect the trust area and its unique amenities and environment for the benefit of residents and all British Columbians in cooperation with municipalities, regional districts, improvement districts, First Nations, other persons and organizations, and the government of British Columbia. This special mandate is entrusted to Islands Trust Council, a 26-member federation of locally elected trustees who represent 13 different local trust committees and Bowen Island Municipality. Next slide, please. The Islands Trust Act sets out that Islands Trust Council must adopt a policy statement, and this is to be a general statement of the policies it will use to carry out the Islands Trust mandate to preserve and protect. Outside of the Islands Trust area, the province requires that local official community plans and land use bylaws align with regional growth strategies that are established by regional districts. But in the trust area, regional growth strategies don't apply. Instead, we have the Islands Trust Policy Statement that guides the development of official community plans and land use bylaws by local trust committees and island municipalities. The policy statement also guides the development of Trust Council's strategic plan, its intergovernmental collaboration, as well as its advocacy efforts across the Islands Trust area. The policy statement has not been significantly updated since it was first adopted in 1994, and a lot has changed in the last 25 years. Most importantly, the document falls short in fulfilling Trust Council's recent commitments to reconciliation, climate change, and affordable housing. So in 2019, Trust Council decided to update the policy statement with those three priorities in mind. The policy statement is Trust Council's document, and it is Trust Council that is leading the amendment process with the support of its committees and staff and the inputs of many. In updating the policy statement, Trust Council must consider and carefully balance feedback from the public, First Nations and Indigenous community members, referral agencies, subject matter specialists, and other interested and affected parties across the entire Islands Trust area. This term, Trust Council defined a limited scope for amendments, mostly focused on the inclusion of new policies related to reconciliation, climate change, and affordable housing, as well as a general update of the introductory sections and definitions. But because the policy statement has not been updated in so many years, many changes were requested and proposed in the new draft. It's important to underscore here that all of the draft amendments listed in the draft new policy statement have undergone legal review and all fall within the existing mandate and jurisdiction of Islands Trust as set out in the Islands Trust Act. Trust Council did not initially intend to update the structure of the policy statement, so the new draft largely follows the form and structure of the current policy statement. But a few new sections have been proposed for policies relating to regional governance, heritage protection, and housing. So the draft new policy statement currently lists policies under the broad categories of regional governance, ecosystem preservation and protection, heritage preservation and protection, and sustainable and resilient communities. Within these broad categories, there are three different types of policies that appear both in the current version of the policy statement as well as the new draft. The first type is commitments of Trust Council. These identify the overarching guiding principles and approaches Trust Council should use when making decisions. These are non-regulatory in nature. The second type, directive policies, are regulatory in nature, and these policies require local trust committees and island municipalities to include certain types of policies and approaches in their local official community plans and land use bylaws. In the policy statement, these directives are generally quite broad as they apply to the whole trust area. But as the directives are implemented locally, they are refined to suit the more specific local context of each island, with opportunities for public input in each local area. The third type is coordination policies, and these outline Trust Council's intentions for working with or advocating to other government agencies and other interested and affected parties. These types of policies are also non-regulatory in nature. They reflect sections 8 and 9 of the Islands Trust Act, which state that Trust Council may enter into coordination agreements and make recommendations to other parties for the purpose of carrying out the Islands Trust mandate. So we wanted to give you a bit of an overview of some of the key draft amendments that are listed in the draft new policy statement. In this phase of engagement, we are seeking public input on the July 2021 version of the draft new policy statement as per Trust Council's direction. We won't have time to outline every single draft amendment, but we will try to walk you through some of the key highlights and clarify some details before we open up the floor to questions. On the topic of reconciliation, there are a number of draft policies and language changes woven throughout the draft new policy statement that have been guided by Trust Council's Reconciliation Declaration, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action, and early and meaningful engagement with First Nations, treaty alliances, and tribal councils in the Islands Trust area. We'll try to outline some of the more notable changes here. For starters, there is a very long overdue acknowledgement of First Nations treaty and territorial rights and relationships to these lands and waters since time immemorial. There are draft commitments of Trust Council stating that land and marine uses in the trust area should not impede the inherent rights of First Nations to access their treaty and territorial lands and waters for cultural, spiritual, or stewardship purposes. There are also draft commitments of Trust Council and directive policies to local trust committees and island municipalities to seek meaningful engagement with First Nations that is guided by the specific reconciliation principles and recommendations that fall within Trust Council's jurisdiction from some foundational documents, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, known as Dripa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice. Draft directive policies have also been added to direct local trust committees and island municipalities to include certain types of reconciliation policies in their official community plans and regulatory bylaws. These include draft policies that preserve and protect Indigenous cultural heritage, harvesting sites, and culturally significant species, and stronger protective policies for the coastal and marine environment. There are also draft policies that prohibit the removal or excavation of soil or fill from middens or foreshore areas that have been identified as culturally significant by First Nations or Indigenous knowledge holders. In addition, there are a number of draft coordination policies of Trust Council outlining its intentions to work together with First Nations, Indigenous knowledge holders, other agencies, and trust area communities to preserve and protect cultural heritage, to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing in a culturally sensitive and respectful manner, and to advocate for safe, secure, and affordable housing for Indigenous peoples. The draft new policy also contains a new section of regional governance policies that builds on the current policy statement section on guiding principles for Trust Council. It lists some overarching guiding principles and approaches that are key to achieving Trust Council's special preserve and protect mandate throughout the Islands Trust area. One of the ways we've incorporated previous feedback from the public and other partners has been to include draft amendments in this section that commit Trust Council as well as local trust committees and island municipalities to place priority on preserving and protecting the environment and Indigenous cultural heritage in all decision-making. The draft amendments also call for decision-making to be guided by the best available area-based mapping, science and social science, local knowledge, and Indigenous ways of knowing, in addition to the precautionary principle, where there may be scientific uncertainty. The precautionary principle recognizes that delaying action until there is compelling evidence of harm will often mean that it is then too costly or impossible to avert the threat. Use of this principle promotes action to avert risks of serious or irreversible harm to the environment. Within the section on ecosystem preservation and protection, a number of draft policies have been proposed to better protect the overall health and integrity of local ecosystems that trust area communities cherish and depend on, and to support ecosystems and communities to mitigate and adapt to climate change. These are listed under subsections on environmental integrity, freshwater stewardship, forest stewardship, agricultural stewardship, soil and minerals stewardship, and coastal and marine stewardship. Next slide. One of the ways we've incorporated feedback from earlier phases of engagement in this section on environmental integrity was to include draft policies for each local planning area to identify, monitor, and mitigate the impacts of climate change through detailed climate risk and vulnerability assessments, adaptive management approaches, and nature-based solutions that promote both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And as with all directive policies, each community will have opportunities for public input about how these policies are implemented locally. In the section on freshwater stewardship, some of the draft directives for the protection of freshwater sustainability have been strengthened to use more clear and measurable terms in line with provincial language to support decision-making in the trust area. And draft coordination policies have been included to suggest that rainwater harvesting should be widely encouraged as a supplemental water source, but not relied upon as a primary water supply. There is also a draft directive policy in this section relating to desalination plants, which we will discuss when we get to the section on coastal and marine policies. In the section on forest stewardship, there are no significant changes to directive policies for local trust committees and island municipalities, but there are some bold draft commitments and coordination policies that signal Trust Council's intentions to advocate to the provincial government for authority to regulate tree cutting in the trust area and for provincial legislation for the Ministry of Forests to prohibit the clear cutting of forests and logging of old growth trees in the trust area. We've been receiving quite a lot of correspondence about these draft changes related to forest stewardship. So we felt it's important to highlight here that if Trust Council is granted authority to regulate tree cutting, this is not expected to affect residents' abilities to remove danger trees, collect firewood, or perform regular land maintenance on their properties. The intent of the proposed advocacy is, as always, to advocate on behalf of the Special Preserve and Protect mandate of Islands Trust. If Trust Council's advocacy here were to be successful, the provincial government would need to change its legislation to give local trust committees the authority to adopt tree protection bylaws. And if that power is granted, local trust committees would then be in a position to decide whether they wish to develop a tree protection bylaw. And that process would involve public input at the local level. In the section on agricultural stewardship, there have been some refinements, but no real significant regulatory changes are being proposed. Some high-level value statements that described agriculture as a traditional and valuable activity in the current policy statement have been removed in the new draft. This is not because agriculture is not valued in the trust area. It's because these words hold different meaning for First Nations, and this value statement was seen to be unsupportive of reconciliation principles and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for action. The draft amendments also indicate a preference for small-scale, sustainable, and regenerative harvesting practices in agriculture, forestry, and aquaculture. Here again, this is an attempt to align the policy statement with Trust Council's Preserve and Protect mandate. So this indicates a preference for harvesting practices that don't compromise the environmental integrity of the region or the safeguarding of Indigenous cultural heritage and harvesting areas. There are also some coordination policies in the agricultural stewardship section that advocate for this approach on lands under the Agricultural Land Reserve and for greater provincial supports to local farmers to adopt the highest standards of environmental protection. We have been hearing many questions and concerns around this section, so we wanted to take a moment here to assure you that these draft policies do not in any way attempt to regulate farming, diminish agricultural livelihoods, or threaten farm stalls in the trust area. The policy statement cannot and has no intention to supersede regulations set out by the Ministry of Agriculture, the Right to Farm Act, or the Agricultural Land Commission Act. Now to a few highlights from the Coastal and Marine Stewardship section. In previous phases of engagement, we heard a strong call from the public and First Nations to better protect the coastal and marine environment of this ecologically and culturally significant region. So the draft amendments in this section strive to minimize the cumulative effects of development on Indigenous cultural heritage and harvesting sites and sensitive nearshore ecosystems that are critical to the health of the Salish Sea. Most notably, there are some draft new directive policies requiring local trust committees and island municipalities to include policies in their local official community plans and regulatory bylaws that prohibit new desalination plants, new private docks, except where properties are boat access only, and new seawalls or other hard shoreline armoring approaches. It's important to note here again that the draft policies are proposing preferred approaches that align with the Preserve and Protect mandate. So water conservation technologies are preferred over desalination plants that could adversely impact nearshore ecosystems. Community and shared docks are preferred over a proliferation of new private docks. And soft shoreline protections that protect both ecosystems and property owners are preferred over hard shoreline armoring approaches that can be more impactful. Lastly, we wanted to highlight some of the proposed draft amendments related to low impact and affordable housing in the draft new policy statement that emerged from previous phases of engagement. The draft contains a new section devoted to fostering low impact and affordable housing, acknowledging that community sustainability and resilience are supported by the availability of diverse and affordable housing that caters to a range of age groups and income levels. This section starts off with draft commitments of Trust Council that all housing in the trust area should be small scale, low impact, energy efficient, and appropriately situated in order to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and safeguard protected area networks, freshwater sustainability, a healthy marine environment, and Indigenous cultural heritage. Draft directive policies in this section require local trust committees and island municipalities to identify appropriate locations where density increases could support safe, secure, and affordable housing without compromising environmental integrity or Indigenous cultural heritage in the region. There are also proposed requirements to identify, assess, and where necessary, regulate the impacts of short-term rentals on the availability of affordable housing in each local planning area. In addition, there are directives to establish appropriate floor area and lot coverage limits for residential development. All of these proposed draft amendments seek to support low impact, affordable housing in alignment with the Islands Trust mandate to preserve and protect. All of them indicate broad approaches and leave the specifics to be defined in accordance with the unique local circumstances of each island and with opportunities for public input at the local level. The Islands 2050 Policy Statement Amendment project is going through several iterative stages, meaning that each stage of the project will build on and be informed by the stages that came before it. In the fall of 2019, we began phase 1 of Islands 2050 public engagement by seeking feedback on community values, concerns about climate change, and opportunities to preserve and protect the trust area. In the summer of 2020, we released a What We Heard report summarizing the feedback we received. We also began a parallel process of early and meaningful engagement with First Nations, which remains ongoing. In the late summer and fall of 2020, Trust Council, its committees, and committee working groups considered the feedback received from many streams of input and developed preliminary policy directions for amendments to the policy statement. Phase 2 of public engagement occurred from January to March 2021 with the release of a policy directions report, a virtual open house, and an associated online survey, inviting public comment on these preliminary policy directions, particularly in the areas of climate change and affordable housing. In the spring of 2021, Trust Council's committees, with the support of staff, carefully balanced all the feedback received to develop draft amendments to the policy statement in accordance with Trust Council's directions. These draft changes were reviewed and refined many times by Trust Council's committees before presenting the draft new policy statement to Trust Council for consideration of first reading in July. However, in July, following expressions of public concern, Trust Council paused the project timeline to undertake a more extensive third phase of public engagement than was originally planned, along with a second phase of early and meaningful engagement with First Nations, treaty associations, and tribal councils, and interagency referrals. That has brought us to where we are now, in phase 3 of public engagement. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your feedback on the draft new policy statement that is currently under review. We are thrilled to be working with a great team of community engagement consultants from ISL Engineering, who have worked very hard to create a meaningful third phase of public engagement. At this point, Trust Council has no definitive date for first reading. After reviewing this next round of inputs from the public, First Nations, and referral agencies on the draft new policy statement, Trust Council will then contemplate its next steps. So there you have a bit of an overview of the project and draft amendment highlights. And I'll now turn the floor back over to ISL to tell you more about the third phase of public engagement. Back to you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Delaney, for walking us through all of that information. I know it's a lot, everybody. So to talk about phase 3 of public engagement, in this phase, we are seeking public input on the draft amendments contained in the draft new policy statement. We'll be seeking feedback directly from the public through a variety of different engagement methods to provide opportunities for as many interested people to participate and share their thoughts with us as possible. Keep a close eye on the Islands 2050 webpage or subscribe to our email list for engagement activity updates and to learn about the many ways you can participate. I will note that the changing rules for COVID have tripped us up a little bit on booking some of our in-person stuff. So that is coming to the website shortly. We just got a little delayed there as COVID had its way with us again. So how will all of this input that we gather be used? As Delaney mentioned, previous phases of public engagement collected information on values, climate change concerns, and thoughts on draft policy directions. Together with input from First Nations engagement, Trust Council committee reviews, and referral agency input, draft amendments to the policy statement were prepared for July 2021. In phase 3, we are seeking feedback on those draft amendments in order to provide Trust Council with updated recommendations on further amendments to the draft new policy statement. Trust Council will need to balance perspectives gathered from the public during this third phase of engagement, along with inputs from others, from First Nations, technical experts, referral agencies, and staff advice as they review and decide on proposed amendments. Following the completion of all the engagement activities for phase 3 in April, ISL will then prepare an engagement summary report for public release in late May. And that's where we're at with phase 3. So I know that we have shared a lot of information with you, and we've been seeing the questions come in. So thank you for that. And we know we've got a lot of questions that came in earlier. I'd like to again thank Chief Bill Williams, Hereditary Chief of Squamish Nation, our presenters and our panelists tonight. As we get started with questions, I want to acknowledge that Islands Trust and some local trust areas have several major initiatives happening right now. So tonight is an opportunity to share some information and ask questions about the policy statement amendment project. And those are the questions we'll prioritize this evening, even though I know that there are lots of questions about how various initiatives may be interrelated. If we can get to some of those, then we will certainly do that. Questions that we receive that are related to topics outside of this project are still being captured by us here at ISL, and we'll be communicating those to Islands Trust to best determine where and how to address those questions. You've been doing it, but a reminder that to submit a question this evening, click on the Q&A tool along the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Our background team is collecting, organizing, and in cases where topic or questions are similar, may combine questions. The question being answered by panelists will appear on screen. Questions will come both from the questions that were asked in advance, as well as the ones we've been receiving through the Q&A tool tonight. We will be preparing a document containing the questions and answers from this evening for the Islands 2050 website. We anticipate that to go up next week. We will also be posting a recording of the Q&A session. If there are questions that we are not able to get to this evening, they will be included in the question document that we post to the webpage. So panelists, I see some of you have, but I'll ask you now to turn on your cameras and join us on screen as we get ready for the question and answer session. All right, I think we're ready for our first question. So if questions do not get answered during the session, how will residents receive information and answers? I did just go through that. So the recording of this session will be posted to the Islands 2050 webpage, and we need just a little bit of time to collate and type questions and answers. So that will be also up on the Islands 2050 webpage, we anticipate next week. Next question, please. Question, will the current draft trust policy statement public engagement process meaningfully include changes to the structure and content of the policy statement? If so, will these changes constitute a rewrite of draft bylaw 183? The public, I can answer part of this, but then I think I will need to reach out to our panelists to answer some of the other elements. So the public engagement process, we are happy to take feedback on changes to the structure, and we are specifically engaging on the content of the draft policy statement. So that is certainly our intent for phase 3 of public engagement, but I will need to ask my Islands Trust co-team members to talk a little bit about some changes to draft bylaws and how that might work.
So sure, would you like me to lead off here, or maybe
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's in the right direction. So thank you for the question. You know, by nature, this is a draft bylaw that has not reached first reading at this juncture, and is certainly going to be amended in some way based upon the input that we have received and the input that we're hoping to receive over this next third phase. And whether the structure of the document changes is also a topic of discussion, but certainly we anticipate taking input from everyone in the trust area and beyond to include in whatever a revised draft would be. And so rewrite perhaps is subject to your point of view if it's substantially changed or minorly changed. And it's too early at this time to determine one way or the other, but we've certainly heard lots from the public about things that should be changed.
And I'll add one piece to that. The other issue is that because we haven't actually got this to first reading, there is input by various, trustees themselves will have input that they want included. So it won't only be public thinking that goes into any changes in this current draft. It will also be thoughts and conversations with trustees working toward the first reading draft.
Wonderful. Next question, please. How will public input be used, taken into consideration in the amendment to the policy statement? How and when will the revisions to the policy statement be shared? I'll again jump in just from the engagement side, that our intention is to provide an engagement summary report to Trust Council to use, but I may need to ask Trustees Luckham and Morrison to jump in and talk more about how that will be used and when you anticipate revisions to the policy statement to be shared. I think you did touch on that a little bit, Trustee Morrison, just now.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and add to that. Yeah. So one of the things I think, in addition to what I just said, is that there is a process inside committee too for some like deeper thinking with a subset of trustees, but it fundamentally is Trust Council's job to decide what version of the draft gets to first reading. And so trustees will be able to synthesize and use the public input, but just because there is specific, because the public is actually quite varied in certain areas. And so trustees will actually need to weigh that information with what they know in science, the advice they're getting from staff and from professionals, and weigh that to decide what is going into the draft. Peter, do you want to add to that?
Well, you've pretty much summarized, but I'll just note that, and thanks for mentioning the committees, because indeed the committee structure sort of it provides recommendations to council on the input that's been received, but all of that input will be received by council, as well as the discussions that happen at committee. Almost half of council sits on that committee, so it's a fairly broad spectrum of individuals. But all of the public input and all of the discussion are held in publicly meetings, although they're virtual these days, of course. And of course, all that input, which will be consolidated by staff, will be presented to committee and then in turn presented to Trust Council in meeting agenda packages. So everything is available to the public and ourselves, and we will be considering all of the input to determine what aspect of the policy statement it applies to, and whether or not we should be implementing it now or considering it further in the future.
And maybe one last thing about that. The best type of feedback that we're receiving is feedback that's very clear, has rational reasons about why you think one way or the other on an issue, and helps trustees really reason with what you're providing. Pummeling trustees with a lot of repetitive emails, that's not actually going to change opinion necessarily. It's arguing a point with clear argument is really what's going to help at this point. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our trustees tonight. Can we get the next question up? Why wasn't a third phase of public engagement undertaken until it was requested by members of the community? I'll take a stab at this, but Islands Trust team, if you want to jump in, because this slightly predates ISL's involvement. But my understanding is that there was a planned third phase of engagement that was going to take place after first reading. But then based on feedback from community members, we are undertaking this third phase now, which is prior to first reading. If I messed that up, please do jump in, Islands Trust team.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of this, and then I'm going to ask Delani to also weigh in on this one a little bit. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the situation that we're in right now is, when we originally tabled the draft last July for this current draft, it was meant to be a draft, but community got very into having it go out for public review, even though it was still not actually, it was meant for trustees to think through and ask and reflect on. And so we're into a sort of pre-first reading public engagement phase. And that really wasn't necessarily the ideal mechanism of doing it. But we wanted to be responsive to what community was saying, and to some of the trustees who were really adamant that for such a big thing that we actually have multiple phases, even though it was not in the original project charter to do that level of public engagement, and people agreed to the original public charter way back. Delaney, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you summarized it well. I would just stress, we were planning a third phase of public engagement, just not as robust as the current third phase has been planned. And as TPC Chair Morrison described, the idea was that we would get a draft, tentative agreement on a draft before it went out for public consultation, but we're sort of in an interim phase right now. And so we're engaging on the current draft, and then Trust Council will contemplate its next steps. So yes, we did originally plan a third phase of engagement, but we listened to your concerns and planned a more robust engagement with the help of ISL.
And this particular phase of engagement is, it's at a different stage. And a lot of that really, it was leveraged around this idea of what people considered changes were able to happen before or after first reading. There was some unclear and some disagreement about what kind of changes would happen before or after. And so we altered this particular phase of engagement to do it before first reading. So, yep.
Wonderful.
Perhaps I'll just add a little bit there. Indeed, there was always a third phase of engagement planned. And this is enhanced. We, through what we heard from the community, we've created this enhanced level of engagement. In fact, following the same things that we did almost 2 years ago when we started this process. But I think the most significant thing here is to think about the process that they were engaged in, is that our normal legislative process is to develop a bylaw and select, get input from the community in whatever way we can, and develop a piece of work that represents what it is that we're thinking about. And then we do take it to first reading. And first reading is the point that normally launches a full-scale public engagement process. And so that's how this was planned to be undertaken. And what we certainly heard loud and clear from folks was not to take it to first reading. And so if there's anything different about this process, it's that we chose to listen to the community, not take it to first reading, and indeed enter into that first phase with an enhanced third phase to be sure that we were reaching everybody and that we were hearing the diversity of points of view that are out there. And so I want to thank everybody for the significant amount of effort that has been put into this by the public, bringing the issues to our attention, and staff rejigging the program in order to facilitate this. In fact, this webinar, these are new things that we've never done before. And I'll also say that we've had levels of engagement that we've never had before. And this is a great day for celebration, because we are hearing so much more than we've heard historically at the Islands Trust, and we are definitely considering it. So.
Wonderful. Our next question, please. So there's a question around whether or not there could or should or would be a plebiscite placed before eligible voters prior to any of the proposed changes being approved. And I think you guys, Trustee Morrison and Trustee Luckham, I think that you have talked a little bit about procedure, but I think that's what this sort of is getting at.
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind, Deb, I'll chime in here. There really isn't a good mechanism within the legislative framework that we work under to hold referendum or plebiscite. Often we get asked about referendum. Often we get asked about voting in local trust committee meetings, and let's have a show of hands and vote on this. The way our legislative mechanism works is different than that. And we are a local government. We're not a committee or a community association where those sorts of things happen at the local level. And so we're doing the next best thing, which is reaching out and soliciting public opinion and digesting that opinion. And certainly we will be weighing all of that in the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Did we want to jump to the next question? We've talked about this, but just to have it here as its own question, what kinds of inputs is Trust Council considering when drafting amendments to the policy statement? Certainly public engagement, public feedback, but other inputs?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are many different sources of information and sources of sort of responsibility that trustees have to consider, and all trustees on Trust Council have to consider. Public feedback is one of them. We also are responsible to our reconciliation efforts with First Nations. We need to ensure that we're meeting our obligations under Dripa. and just our ethical obligations in this space and place that has been, stewarded so amazingly since time immemorial. So we need to make sure that we're meeting those obligations. And then we also have we have responsibility to consider not only who is living in the trust area right now, but who is living in the trust area in the future. The non-human organisms that are living in the trust area are our responsibility. And we are also actually stewarding this area for the rest of British Columbia. So we have to consider all of those aspects as we deal with our decision making. And from that perspective, a lot of the information that we're also getting from organizations, from staff, our own understandings and knowledge from living in this space, those are all influencing us. And I think I would also add at this point, our interpretations of the Trust Act are influencing us, and we'll probably come back to that. But I've seen some of the questions in terms of thinking about like, will we have to narrow or expand our understanding of what is included in the trust policy statement? And because we're, different people disagree on like, what's the object of the trust? Well, trustees disagree too. And that's part of the process, is the trustees themselves have to actually work through that. And no one trustee, like myself included as the chair of the trust program committee, no one trustee has any more say than any other trustee in this. It's important that we all actually have, input into this process. And we're very careful on thinking about who is on the trust policy committee to get the widest possible breadth of opinions on that committee so we could have good input into the process.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Our next question up, please. I recently completed the public engagement survey and was wondering who created the survey and who reviewed and approved it. So ISL created the survey. In it, we are asking about the draft amendments. So the draft amendments are organized by category that Delaney was presenting earlier, and then also by whether they are a commitment, a directive policy, or a coordination policy. And so that was to really get at reviewing some of the amendments. Who reviewed and approved it? We certainly worked in collaboration with the Islands Trust staff on making sure that we were accurately representing the contents of the draft amendment in as plain language a way as we can. I'm not going to lie, it's complex to take some of the subtleties of policy writing and turn it into a survey, but that was ISL who wrote it, and definitely we reviewed it with Islands Trust before we went live on Friday. Next question, please.
Can I just?
Oh yes, sorry, if you want to jump in on that.
Delaney, do you have anything else you want to add on that?
No, I didn't have anything else.
Okay, thanks.
Another engagement question. How do people without access to technology get involved and participate in the public engagement process? So one of the reasons why we have so many ways to participate in the process, there is this Q&A as a bit of a way to information share. We also have coming up, they will be virtual, so it doesn't fully address this question, virtual community workshops. And then we will have a whole series of in-person events on islands. And we will have a paper version of the survey with a bit of discussion guide and background information that are available for pickup and drop off, and can be filled in by hand. So there's a few different mediums that will be available to people. I mentioned earlier, just with the rapidly changing what is possible and what protocols are for in-person and even pick up and drop off, we're closing in on being able to publish that information about when things will be happening and where they will be happening in person. But there is definitely an in-person and a paper version of ways to participate in addition to the virtual ways to participate. So hopefully that answers that question.
And I would encourage people in community, those of you who do have technology, I would encourage you to actually help and work with people in your communities who aren't tech savvy. You know, we live in small island communities. Reach out to those people who don't seem to have a voice and help them have a voice. That's part of what we can do.
And thank you. Maybe I'll just chime in on one thing to enhance what you've already advised us there, Kirsty. I had a conversation earlier today with a gentleman from one of the islands that was expressing this same concern, and that's a lot of people in our island communities, for island lifestyle reasons, don't have technology, don't have computers, don't have internet, don't have cell phones, and don't want them. And so we are aware of that, and we are making every effort to reach out and be in community and participate in community. And mail outs are something that we're going to be doing, and there's going to be a lot of information that's going to be mailed out to the entire Islands Trust area as well. So as Deb has said, yeah, please assist anybody that you know isn't connected. And we are happy to hear and find ways to communicate with those folks. And we will be holding in-person meetings where humanly possible under COVID rules, as best we possibly can. So, and unfortunately, some of it may end up being even last minute, because we are having difficulty with community centers on your islands. And so any help that you can actually provide with respect to providing those facilities would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Did you want to jump to the next question? Oh, this one. Oh, this one looks like it'll be a little bit technical, so I'll read it out, and then panelists, if you want to jump in and share the answer on this one. So, why does the new policy statement not include septic contamination integrated within the water resource section? And how will you protect marine life from polluted seepage? Why are land use decisions and policies not including septic seepage as a consideration for increasing densification?
So I'm wondering, Peter, if we want to throw this one into Delaney and David.
Yeah, I certainly think that this is drilling down to a level which I think is more local regulation and deeper than what the policy statement general statements are. But I think David Marler would be the appropriate person that could maybe more clearly frame that.
Yeah, if you'd like, I could respond to this. So that is what I was just going to say, is that the policy statement is very high level general document, and the official community plans would then drill down into the more specifics for the islands. However, the concept of having concerns around septic contamination, those ideas could be dealt with through other policies already in the policy statement around environmental protections, for example. But it is something that council could consider, is having specific policies around septic contamination in the policy statement if it so wishes. So the second half of the question here, why land use decisions and policies not including septic seepage as a consideration for increasing densification? That is something that would be dealt with definitely at the local trust committee level when it's developing LCP and land use bylaw regulations. And septic seepage, again, is an environmental consideration that the policy statement already has policies around.
It would be good, though. It's a great question, and it would be good for us. And since we have the question in front of us now, we'll pin that and bring that into committee to see if there's an amendment, if we want to be more specific or not. So we'll check with other trustees around that.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just, for clarity, David, ask you, rather than make a statement myself, but ask you that there are other levels of authority that are responsible for public health and sewage. Certainly, we require sometimes placement of septic and sewage systems, and certainly we need to consider riparian area regulations and those sorts of things. But typically, the more critical public health and fish and wildlife effects are mostly considered by others. Would that be true?
Yeah, that is true. Again, when we're developing the policy statement, the official community plans and land use bylaws, we're working very closely with the agencies responsible for things like septic disposal and we would take their consideration into account as well.
David.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Next question. Why isn't the virtual question and answer session occurring in an open public forum where attendees can listen and participate in a dialogue and are provided an opportunity to seek clarification on answers provided? So we do have a large variety of input types. And one of the reasons we've chosen this format for a question and answer period was really to focus on sharing some information about the policy statement itself, and as well as some of the proposed changes, and then really focus one question at a time and make sure we could get through as many questions as we want. Some of the opportunities that are coming up that are more dialogue based is the virtual community workshop, which I will mention towards the end, but just note it's held over 2 evenings, March 15th and March 22nd. So that will be coming up. And also the in-person sessions, as soon as we can confirm that we're good to go on those locations, that will be another opportunity for a dialogue-based way to participate. So that was one of the decisions about tonight, was just to really be able to focus one question at a time and get through as many as we can. I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in there, but we can jump to the next question if not.
Just comment. It's actually been coming up 2 years when Islands Trust Council left the council chambers on Salt Spring Island to a pandemic. And that has changed everything that we do with engaging with the public and holding community and public meetings. And we want to come back to more public meetings, and we would love to be able to do more open public forums. But even with the scheduling of these meetings 2 years later, we're having difficulty. And of course, through this electronic means, we're able to access a much larger, much broader audience all across the island. And nobody needs to travel anywhere or any of these factors. And it's interesting to note that there's no turning back from going to this electronic meeting forum at this point. When we struggle with this day to day, because some people want us to come back to public meetings and others don't want to attend any public meetings under any circumstances. So now we're trying to do this hybrid thing. And this is sort of this is the introduction to this 2050 third phase of engagement to get us kicked off and started, get the questions out there, get the policy statement message out there. And then we're going to be making every possible effort to come into your communities to have those public forums.
Thank you, Peter. Do you want to bring up our next question? Are there any policy statement amendments proposed on non-fossil fuel power, for example, preference for solar or wind, invasive, non-invasive species, for example, holly, broom, etc., or open burning smoke control regulation?
That's a super interesting question. I'm gonna go to Delaney in a second around that. I am not off the top of my head thinking there was any, so I'll get Delaney to clarify that. But really interesting questions. From my initial feeling around this is that many of those are very specific. There are some general things around climate change that would cover many of these, but they're going to be more detailed, so they're going to be in OCPs and in land use bylaws and community. But Delaney or David, do you want to name anything here?
Yeah, from my recollection, I think this is one question which would be good for us to respond in written form in the kind of document afterwards. I'll go have a careful look through the whole draft new policy statement. From my recollection, I don't recall policies specific to these items that are new. David, I'm not sure if you want to comment at all about whether these would be too specific for the nature of the policy statement or whether there's room for these kinds of policies.
So again, it's a general policy document, and I think the level of detail that council wants to go through, that's up to council. So I wouldn't say yes and no that these should be in, they shouldn't be out. I do think they fit the climate change, and some policies could be developed around them if they're not already there.
And I think that one thing too I'd like to clarify at this point is what we're doing right now is we're doing a review of the entire document that has not been updated for a significant period of time. That is not the intent of council going forward. The intent of council going forward is to actually keep on top of like edits like this. So these things, if they're not in this current round, doesn't mean that they won't be in some future, like in the next year or the year after that. So we can make sort of adjustments and tweaks to this as we go on in a much more iterative process than has been done in the past. So that's also something that's different about thinking about the trust policy statement now and going forward, is there's no intent to leave it sitting for 25 years, as we go forward now.
I'll just comment, this is a really terrific question because it opens up the horizon of interest and concerns that people have in the Islands Trust area, and in fact, in non-Islands Trust areas and around the globe. What's interesting to note is some of these things are already in OCPs and LUBs on some of the islands. Open burning, for instance, is a provincial regulation and often managed by regional districts. And in many places, it's not permitted. Invasive species, certainly on a lot of the LTCs that I've worked on over the years, for replanting of vegetation in a development, there's a requirement for native species to be planted. And indeed, that non-native species management is also managed to some extent by other agencies. But there's many different issues that sort of surround this. These are just 3 examples, very good examples that can already be dealt with within local land use regulations. Certainly the policy statement would encourage these kinds of things and already does in many ways in sections of the policy statement that exist already. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Just before we go to the next question, or after, that's Andrea, sorry. I just want to remind people, if you're coming to the session after I've mentioned this a couple of times, if you want to submit a question tonight, you can do so through the Q&A tool. It's on the bottom bar of your screen if you're in Zoom, and it's not showing, it sometimes hides. If you wiggle your mouse or touch your screen, depending on your device, a bottom bar should pop up there with a Q&A tool and you can type your question in. Sorry about that, Andrea, if you want to go to the next question. So what would be the high level benefits of a no desalination policy? I think that's sort of getting at why that's been looked at in the draft amendments. I'm not sure, Delaney, David, if that's something you guys want to take on.
I think that was David was going to handle that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that one. The reason that the policy is in there is from a precautionary approach, and that is that there are some concerns around desalination with regards, first of all, to the energy demands that it requires, or the adverse impacts of desalination on things like the foreshore, the ecosystem, and even the upland, because where you discharge the brine, the salt that you're taking out of the water, that has to go somewhere, and quite often it's just pumped back into the ocean, and it creates a high salinity in that particular area. So there's a lot of environmental reasons, and also from a climate change with respect to the energy consumption. So that's one of the reasons it's been put in here, to address that. There's obviously other ways that could be addressed. So, but the current wording is that no desalination be in there. So I'll just leave it at that. But those are the very high level reasons why that's been put in.
Thank you for sharing that with us, David. Do we want to switch to the next question? Why is there no water resource policy limiting the number of cisterns and septic fields in high density and water stressed areas? That also sounds a bit technical, so I look to our Islands Trust staff to help us with that one.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is policies around this. We may not be directly stated, so that's something we could certainly look at. There's no reason. It's maybe again like some of the other questions around climate change that we've had, that you know, it's probably in there, but not in a very obvious way. So this is something else that council could look at to put into the policy statement. I will say that there are some local trust committees that have their own policies and their own regulations in areas that on their islands that have issues with water, where there are requirements for cisterns. Turner Island has that in some locations. So yeah, it's something that definitely could be put in at policy level if council would like to make that more obvious.
And I actually just want to also add something here, David. So one of the high level policies, and Delaney probably has the language a little bit more at her fingertips, but one of the higher level policies is around water conservation and like thinking about water management generally. The idea is that like islands are actually very different across the trust area in terms of water. And so really understanding what the local implementation of that is something that would be done in OCPs and bylaws. But the broad brush stroke is that every island cluster should look at what they should do around water management. So there are actually policies that guide around this, just not to the detail of this level. That's a local detail issue. And on my own island, we've been really engaged in that for this term. It has been a focus, and we've done a water study. Like a lot of the Southern Gulf Islands, which are heavily impacted by drought issues, are looking at that. Delaney, did you want to add something too? Because I know that this is an area that we've talked about.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just highlight that in the freshwater stewardship policies section, there is a advocacy policy that actually was refined from the current policy statement. The current policy statement encourages water cisterns for water conservation purposes. And one of the refinements was adding the words above ground because of the impacts to cultural heritage of cisterns below ground. So that's one change that has happened. With regards to what's being proposed here, I would just say that we would love to hear your ideas for what's missing in the current draft of the policy statement. We hear a lot of comments on the draft amendments, but if you are able to fill out the survey, there are some open areas where you could suggest these, and we would then bring them forward to Trust Council for their consideration. That will help us improve the document. So thank you.
One last thought here that you just brought up, and I think Peter has something to add too. So one last thought here. So the clarification between directive policies and advocacy policies, if you can just make a statement, Delaney, just clarifying that again, because I know that we talked about it earlier, but I just want to make sure people are understanding the difference, because you just said advocacy policies there.
Sure. I'm actually going to just pull up the way we've explained them earlier in the presentation. So directive policies are regulatory in nature, and they require local trust committees and island municipalities to include certain types of policies and approaches in their OCPs and bylaws, in their official community plans and bylaws. But coordination policies are basically intentions of Trust Council to work with or advocate to other government agencies and other interested and affected parties, which includes trust area communities and property owners. And these are non-regulatory in nature. And so they're basically indicating Trust Council's intentions to advocate on behalf of the island's trust mandate.
Thank you. And just so everyone's clear, I actually often think of advocacy policies as exactly what you just said, coordinating policies. So we have a certain mandate within the trust, and other agencies and our communities themselves have mandates. And we are trying to be coherent in how we're implementing all of this so that we actually have good, like effective, multi-ecological policies that work together. So thank you for that. Chair Lacamaya, I think we keep interrupting you. Did you want to add something?
Oh,
This island is connected. Chair
I
Lac.
was gonna say,
No, one has.
oh, there we
go.
are.
We got you.
And Are we okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. So there's two ways to read the question, but I think what's the most significant here is that this is a conversation that we're having and we're thinking about these things, because rainwater collection is certainly the number one thing that people talk about when there's water shortage. And that requires tanks and cisterns of some kind. And in fact, there's potential, there's also conversations around whether or not every new home that's built should have a cistern or should have water tanks to provide rainwater for those non-potable water uses. In the 25 years since, and just round numbers, in the 25 years since the policy statement was last amended, septic field technology and managing and handling sewage has changed dramatically. Anybody that's in the building trades or developing knows septage is a big thing today. But that said, let's call it 50%. Let's just be generous. 50% of the homes that are on the islands have septic fields that are more than 25 years old and are inadequate by today's standards. So there's certainly lots of room for discussion on this topic. And lots of people think that there should be no policies. There should be more advocacy policies, or there should be more directive policies. And sometimes around water and public health and natural environment, there's pressures to be more directive. But at the same time, and I'm on that side of the street, is we want to provide opportunities for education and learning, and opportunities to provide individuals and developers and builders to do the right thing in the first place. And ideally, we don't have to be hard on regulation. But the truth is, land use planning is a regulatory mechanism, and we have to find a place to do that. And the policy statement helps LTCs and communities develop the best way to facilitate sustainable communities, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, and the long-term supply of fresh water, which is critical to not just people, but to the environment and the plants and the species that are here that are already stressed. And through, as we've seen in the last number of years with the climate change, those species are changing and are more and more stressed.
Thank you, panelists. We'll jump to the next question, which Delaney sort of talked about a little bit. So great premonition there, Delaney. How can residents propose new content for the policy statement? So we've seen a couple of examples of that tonight through the questions. There is an opportunity through the survey, through some of the questions around what might we have missed, or what did we not ask you that was important to you. There will be opportunities through the in-person events once we get started with those, and there'll be an opportunity through the virtual community workshop coming up later this month. So there will be a number of ways through this engagement, phase 3 engagement, that you'll be able to do that. And then I don't know if there were any other ways beyond that. I just thought I'd check with panelists for ways I might not know about. I am a bit tunnel visioned on the phase 3 engagement. So if there are other ways, please jump in.
Yeah, I will jump in. So one of the things I think that this question also kind of alludes to is the idea that everything has to be in this policy statement version. And I just want to really caution people on that thought. So because this is such a big jump from where the previous version was, that it's quite likely that many things that are currently in the statement won't be in the draft that gets actually to first reading. As trustees go through and like reflect on what communities are saying to them, reflect on their own understandings and what they're comfortable supporting in this moment, there will be changes. And what will happen at that moment, and with all the feedback that we're getting in, is that we will create a sort of cut list, or a list that's kind of a parking lot list, or maybe there's some other way, it's a marina list or something, a list of like things that are not in the current statement, but that are being considered, either because we have had staff advice to consider them, or community members have asked for it, or trustees themselves are interested in having that. And so that list will still maintain, even if it doesn't like go into the current or the next version of the trust policy statement that will go forward for first reading. And that list is always contributable to. So you can email staff at you know, like Delaney and other staff all the time, and you can say to your current trustees like that you want additional things added to that list, and those things will be considered in future revisions, and those revisions are not going to be years and years out. They're going to be like more rolling revisions, and so that's a really helpful thing to do. So don't feel if you don't get everything in this first time, or you're unable to process it because there's so much going on, so many changes, don't feel that you're not going to be able to participate. You are going to be able to participate and contribute to thinking as going forward. Peter, do you want to add any to that? I know this is a concern for many folks.
You've really pretty much captured it. You know, what I like to suggest is that it's a living document.
Mhm.
And what we haven't actually done is honor that over the last 25 years because of so many other priorities and, you know, budget restrictions and the like, quite honestly. But the intention is that it be a living document. And in fact, it may be that a number of the items that have come up within this public engagement process and what we're about to hear over the next couple of months here may not make it into this next revision of the policy statement, but they will certainly be topics of continued discussion and debate at council to figure out what it is that policy statement needs to elaborate. And so it is a living document, and this phase of it may not be as, maybe we're a little over ambitious with trying to make the amendments that have been delineated. And so maybe they won't all make it. Maybe only a few will make it. But it's important that we start this process and get it rolling so that it becomes a living document for the future.
And I think the other piece of that is what you mentioned earlier, that part of being able to understand what may not make it in this time and is learning together, learning why something like salinization is actually important. Like maybe we need all to learn a little bit more and to think about that together. And so that's going to be part of like that living document move.
Awesome. That's a great question. Thanks for asking and thanks for answering, all the panelists. Our next question is, how do people get more details about the public engagement process and timeline? So our key hub for accessing information about the public engagement process and timeline is on Islands 2050. We are continually updating that as new elements of the phase 3 engagement roll out. We are, as Chair Luckham had mentioned, using mailouts to get the word out, and we are looking at putting ads in local papers and newsletters to also get the word out. So there's those are sort of, and social media, sorry. So we're using social media and local papers and mailouts as a way to push information out to people. A place to go to find it is through the project webpage. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that one. Those are our key ways of getting information out to folks.
Click the subscribe button on the website.
Thank you.
Emails
Thank you.
But write to us, phone us, whatever you need to do.
I do. Yeah, I do have to stress that it is very helpful if you talk to your local trustees. And like, you know, you really talk to them and tell them what you want. And, you know, they are advocates for you. They sit at the table and vote. And that is your most direct pathway, frankly, to understanding and getting decisions made. And, you know, being clear about why, not just yelling at your local trustees, because I don't know about you, but my community generally is much more respectful in how they interact with me, but like really trying to think carefully about how you're arguing and why you're arguing, sitting down in calm moments and talking it through, you know, those are really, really helpful things to be doing.
Thank you. And thank you for the reminder about subscribing to emails. I can't believe I forgot that one. So if we want to jump to the next question, just for panelists' knowledge, this is related to some change in wording around freshwater, some of the policies on freshwater. And for those watching at home, this in quotes is from, I believe, the current policy statement, and there's a question about why that's been removed from the draft policy statement. So I don't know, Delaney, if you want to jump in on that one, or anybody else.
Go ahead, Delaney.
Okay, I'll just say a few words and then pass it over to David. So this policy hasn't actually been removed, it's just been refined, and actually it's been strengthened. The terms were refined to align with provincial language such that they're more easily measurable and can inform decision makers in a better way. So, so there is a new policy, I believe it's 4.2.7 for those of you who are deeply into the new draft. Yeah, 4.2.7, and it basically says neither the density nor intensity of land use is increased in groundwater regions. Groundwater regions are delineated water management areas that provide a useful basis for assessing area-specific water quality and quantity characteristics for planning purposes. And where the quality or quantity of the supply of fresh water is likely to be inadequate or unsustainable. And those again are terms that are used by the province. And so we've just aligned that language, but it actually, the intention is to actually strengthen this policy. And I don't know, David, if you wanted to add anything else.
I have nothing to add to that. I think that's what I would say.
Okay.
Maybe I'll add to it, you know, for me anyway, this is one of the really hot topics because we have had a lot of over the years I've been a trustee, a lot of serious conversations about this very section when we're being asked to increase density or intensity of land use in areas. And any improvement in the language that we can get here to be able to help us make those decisions about whether or not any sort of development or increased intensity of density of lands is justifiable in the context of preserving and protecting the water supply, not just for the people that live there, but for the natural environment as well. But we've had difficulty with this at LTCs, at executive committee, at council with water for years. And so an improvement in the language to help us with our decision making, and mostly it's to help us understand what that section of the policy statement means, because it was written in a period where certainly there was interest in preserving and protecting the water supply, but it's significantly more intense now. There's no denying that. And of course the densities are, you know, the recent census tells us 25% roughly, more in some locations, less in others, but big increases in densities on the island. And indeed the water supply is being taxed. So we want to be able to make the best informed decisions that we can with respect to that and with respect for the water supply.
And if I could just add one more thing, I would just say that in the first two phases of engagement, we heard very, very strong feedback from the public that this is a priority concern for those respondents in those first two phases. So this is responding to that, and the intention is to strengthen the policy.
We understand that water is like paramount for so many islands, if not all of them. And, you know, as we get different pressures, changing sea level, changing precipitation, we are out to ensure that we have safe, fresh water supplies.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody. If we want to go to our next question. Can local trust committees opt out of policy statement directive policies? Aren't they required?
Oh, can I take this one?
Yes, jump on in.
All right. So we have a challenge as a federation of, 13, LTCs pulled together under the Islands Trust area. The Trust Council itself is mandated to implement the Trust Act, and they do that through the Trust Policy Statement. Local trust committees have dual authorities. They have the Trust Act that influences them, and they have the Local Government Act that influences them. So local trust councils have to balance those things and have to manage a lot of different components of that. So the Trust Council is there to ensure that the Trust Act itself is implemented. And so no, local trust committees cannot opt out of direct policies. And that's because the act is supposed to be implemented. And the Trust Council is all of the LTC elected officials are on the Trust Council, and they get a say in what that trust policy statement says. But sometimes local pressures might make it so that it's very hard to implement the Trust Act in their local area. And the Trust Council is the one that is the body that is mandated to try and ensure that that is happening. Trust Chair Luckham, did I go astray?
Well, no, you're pretty close. However, and maybe David Marler might chime in for sure, because in the existing context of the policy statement, as requirements that certain amendments at local trust committee meet policy statement requirements, it comes up to the executive committee, and the executive committee confirms or denies that rationalization that yes, it does or does not. And if executive committee says, no, it does not meet the standard, there is a possibility for an LTC to protest that decision and have council make a decision. But it's certainly where there's a gray area, you could certainly manage to facilitate that. It would be, we've only ever done that, I think, once in the entire history of the Islands Trust. But it is possible. There is a mechanism to protest.
Yeah, and that mechanism is to protest it, but the decision still lies with Trust Council about, yeah. Sorry, David, do you want to add to that?
No, I was going to say that the policy statement is Trust Council's policy document, and the courts in BC over the last years around policy has determined that the local government or the council that adopts the policy is the one to interpret it. So in this case, it would be Trust Council, and that's supported by the legislation. So local trust committees, when we're advising them of what we think council's interpretation is of a particular document and the policy, and the local trust committee would then, if they don't agree with that, they would have to submit an alternative and see if council would agree with them. We've had those discussions come up at the executive committee, where a local trust committee has wanted to get some early advice as to their interpretation to see if they're on the right track. The other thing is that the current policy statement is written in that the word is address. So an address can be any range of policies. So that's another thing that has to be considered is the local trust committee's addressing of it, does it meet the policy? And that's up to the executive acting for Trust Council to determine.
And maybe one other thing there, David, and in fact, bylaw enforcement suggests this from time to time, is that if you're running up against a regulation or a bylaw that ends up initiating enforcement or is not palatable to the community, then you should change the bylaws. Or if you're not prepared to enforce them, then you should change the bylaws. And so certainly as time goes on and we find that there's some directive policy in the policy statement that is not working for LTCs or not working in the best interest of the Federation, then it's certainly possible for that to be revised as a living document. If there's more knowledge that comes to bear or circumstances change, that there couldn't be a change. That said, it wouldn't be immediately effective in a community because it would be a drawn out process which would require public consultation to amend the policy statement. We wouldn't be just doing it willy-nilly. We'd have to go through a proper consultative process. But the intention is not for the policy statement to be unreasonable, but to be respecting and reflecting the common interest that is provided to us in the mandate from the province.
And I also think that, and David said this a couple times here today, but the policy statement is meant to have general policies that are localized as they're implemented. So local trust committees are the ones who actually define exactly how it's going to be implemented. And so for some communities, many things that are in the new trust policy statement draft, they've already implemented them because they're ahead of the policy statement. And so, those communities aren't going to feel that it's, challenging to get to that point. Other communities may see that they have a lot of differences with the, what may get into being as the new trust policy statement. And so one of the things when you get a rub between those types of policies, there's two solutions we have, right? One would be to argue for the local policies to be different or to rub up against Trust Council, which we are seeing in some communities. And the other one would be to actually just pause, take a deep breath as a community, and actually try to ask why a group of 26 people think that, or a majority anyway of 26 people think that these policies are good things. So like really try to learn and take a learning stance before you automatically reject something just because it's new or different. Like really think about why it might be there. So that would also be something that we can do in our communities.
Thank you, everybody. Did you want to switch to the next question? What is Dripa? We did talk about that, but maybe we can come back and revisit that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in first if I can, Delaney, and then so Dripa, it stands for the Declaration of Rights on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and it's a 2019 act of the province of British Columbia. It's the implementation of the UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration Rights of Indigenous People, and it meets our obligations under reconciliation efforts, so our own reconciliation efforts with First Nations in this region. I would just like to say that I'm really proud of Trust Council. We were ahead of Dripa, so in our own reconciliation declaration. So I just really want to name that the Islands Trust actually is moving forward in ways that are innovative and can lead many other local governments and municipal governments. So Delaney or Peter, do you want to name anything in there?
Well, the calls to action from the reconciliation work in Canada has brought this to us, to every local government and to every citizen to come to understand this. And indeed, this is the provincial government version of that, of which every minister and every ministry is held responsible to.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, yeah, Dripa is sort of an enabling act that the province has. And so the next steps for the province is to look at all of its legislation and bring it into line with Dripa, whatever that looks like. And one that they've already done is they've amended the Interpretation Act to essentially bring in the constitutional rights for Indigenous peoples, which essentially says that when you're reading any legislation, including the Islands Trust Act, including the Local Government Act, the Community Charter, you have to read it as if it's aligned with the rights of Indigenous people. That is that there's the requirement to engage and to consider that. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
And maybe one last thought on this too. When we talk about acts or we talk about things that we're trying to implement as acts, I also want us to own that those to me anyway, and I'll just speak personally here, those to me are the low bar, right? Like what we really want to be doing is we want to be actually deeply engaging and thinking forward in what are the best ways to truly reconcile our own past actions in this space with how we want to be as communities going forward in the rights of First Nations peoples, and co-management and different ways that we can explore. So there are lots of places that we can go that are past what even Dripa allows. And those are things that we have to consider in our communities as we actually really work to truly engage in reconciliation and learn and know the peoples that have been in the spaces since time immemorial.
Wonderful. Thank you, panelists. We'll go to our next question. Can you tell me more about how the Trust is going to prioritize global climate crisis in the amendments to the policy statement? You did touch on that a little bit, Delaney, when you were giving us our the overview, but if you wanted to expand on that, or any other panelists want to expand on that, that'd be great. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, so there are many ways that Trust Council is attempting to address climate change in the draft new policy statement. And I would say that it starts with a sort of approach or value, you could say, that the climate resilience of trust area communities is dependent on healthy and functioning and thriving ecosystems who are also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So we've looked both at the impacts to ecosystems and communities, I mentioned in the presentation earlier that there are some broad approaches. The precautionary principle is one of them, just acknowledging the uncertainties around climate change and how it will unfold in the coming years. The policy statement also suggests adaptive management approaches, which require ongoing monitoring and evaluation of the impacts of climate change and policy adjustments as needed, and also nature-based solutions that seek solutions that help communities become more resilient to climate change and also result in biodiversity benefits. There are directives for climate vulnerability assessments to be undertaken in each local planning area, and that acknowledges that the impacts are going to look different on each island. And generally, there's a strengthening of the environmental protection policies and policies related to protected area, safeguarding protected area networks, so that species have migration corridors as they're increasingly threatened by these impacts. There are quite a number of them, I think too many for me to highlight here. We do have a fact sheet that's been recently posted to the island's 2050 webpage. There are a number of fact sheets actually, and maybe Christy can speak to those. But one of them is on climate change. It highlights some of those, some of the draft amendments. And if there's anything, as I said before, if there's anything that that members of the public feel are missing, we'd really love to hear what you have to say through the survey and all the other engagement activities. And I don't know, Chair Morrison, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think my theme tonight is going to be, there's a lot of things in here that might seem confusing to people because it's a really complicated topic, right? Like we're talking about changing lands and waters and a historically like already changed social and political system. And so there's lots of changes that we're seeing in this space. One of the things that like my professional career is helping people understand climate change, particularly with respect to justice. And it is really challenging. And so one of the things that I encourage everyone to do is just take one issue locally that's important to you. It could be fire management, it could be water management, it could be sea level infiltration into groundwater, it could be any local issue, it could be herring. I know that's a favorite out there. So any of those issues, and then just research, Google that issue and put climate change after it. And every one of those will have some aspect of climate change that you can learn around because you're interested in the topic, and then expand your knowledge from there, because it's a complicated topic that is completely interwoven in our lives today and going forward even more so. And so I often hear, I guess still I need to, the sort of last point I would make on this, I often hear that, well, we're not cities, right? We're small rural communities. And so what can we really do about climate change? And the reality is that that's literally a question all small rural communities are starting to engage and ask. And there are lots of things we can do. And just because our impact might be slightly different or potentially smaller, that's not even clear actually, than cities, it doesn't mean we should do nothing, because literally climate change is an all hands on deck, everyone do something, whatever is in your scope. So we really appreciate trying to think creatively about what is in our scope and to encourage and coordinate with others about other agencies that have it in their scope.
Wonderful. We'll go to the next question here. It's another juicy one. Will the governance report that Trust Council will receive in March impact the policy statement amendment process? So I did mention, if you missed it at the beginning, that we are aware, we know that you guys have got a lot of big pieces in movement now. So I think this is just a question about how those two particular initiatives, this one, the policy statement amendment project, and the governance report relate or interact. So I don't know, trustees, if this might be to you, I think.
So I'll jump in anyway and start it off, having sat on the select committee that guided the And Chair Morrison also sat on that same committee that guided the work of getting this contract fulfilled to deliver a report that analyzed the governance and management of the Islands Trust. I'm very pleased to see that work is now before us. Council has yet to review it and discuss it and determine whether or not it agrees with some or all or parts of it. It is a draft and there are some errors in it and that need to be corrected in terms of language and what how some things work. But is it going to affect? There's two ways to look at that. Is the governance review going to affect the process that we're in our public engagement and our drafting of bylaws? Or is there things in the governance review that might cause us to pause and build topics into or enhance topics or delete topics from the policy statement itself, and how we might create it as a document and make it available? So it's early days for that. One of the things that I like to think of is the policy statement work, and the policy statement itself is the why. Why do we care, and why are we delivering on the preserve and protect mandate? The governance report is a topic that's looking at how we do that. And so I would say there are two parallel streams that due to circumstances are happening right now, but they are discrete in their own way. Certainly there's some impact and influence that would cross over in both directions, actually. But I think it's early to tell. And I think that the policy statement is the why are we preserving and protecting, what's important, the values, and the governance is the how are we doing it.
Yeah, and I would say too that, after our March Trust Council, which is next week, I believe, that we will, that question will be a little bit more self-evident as people sort of, look at it. So I think we'll just leave that until Trust Council has a say on it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And the next question, I do know that you guys were just talking about budget recently. And so I think this question is just around, having just come out of that discussion, what are the budget implications for the proposed policy statement now and into the future for Islands Trust? I don't know if you guys have had some thoughts on that.
Well, Deb, I think that the budget has been proposed for 2022-23. It includes presently the work that is going to continue on after March, April, May, June. It's going to include that work presently. So no additional impacts as a result of these events will be necessarily incurred. There may be things that we don't spend money on. There may be other areas that we do spend money on, and there may be some shuffling around of monies within the overall budget. But at this point, certainly in this coming fiscal cycle, there's not any specific fiscal actions that would be undertaken. So the work will continue. And certainly that said, there are definitely costs associated with doing it that have been included at this time.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of into the future, and budget implications, again, budget next week will kind of unfold how Trust Council thinks about the budget. So I can't really speak to that because I'm one trustee and it's Trust Council's decision about the budget. But into the future, one of the things to consider is that the trust policy statement is the interpretation that the Trust Council has of the object of the trust. And the object of the trust is what we build strategic plans around, which is then what we build budgets around. And so if the trust policy statement defines more clearly what is the object of the trust and what isn't, by what is included and what isn't in any given moment, then that will actually lead to decisions and will help you trustees argue, yes, this should be included in the budget. No, that shouldn't be included in the budget. Because if it's not in the trust policy statement, then it either shouldn't be on the strategic plan or it fulfills a local government act component that a local trust committee is pulling in to ask funding for. because the Local Government Act still impacts our budget. Our budget is not only impacted by the trust policy statement. There are things that local trust committees may ask to have on their project list that aren't directly related to the trust policy statement, but are constrained by the guidance in it.
Wonderful.
You've
Sorry.
made me think about some other things here that are worth just mentioning, in that, because there have been questions, and maybe there'll be more questions that pop up here on this topic. Rollout costs are of the policy statement. And, you know, really, one policy statement, it might be different than the previous policy statement, but the development of OCPs and regulate and bylaws in communities at the moment have to reflect on policy statement directives and advocacy. And so there isn't going to be much change as communities evolve. There's no forced sort of mandate that every OCP and every bylaw has to be changed in order to meet the policy statement. As time marches on and OCPs and bylaws are amended, they will need to reflect the values that are contained in the most recent version of the policy statement. And as we said earlier, it's a living document, and that would change over time. So no direct effect. That said, if there's a necessity for there to be more scientific data or research necessary to help LTCs make decisions, land use decisions, there may be costs with that. But I feel it's also important to note that we've become very creative over the last number of years with seeking funding, external funding, to help fund some of this research and this data that we need for water and marine mapping and those sorts of things. And we would obviously continue to do that. The Islands Trust has built a lot of interest out there in the community, knowing the work that we do. And indeed, funding agencies look favorably upon us when we're seeking financial support for some of that research data and that information and that knowledge and that education and those sorts of things. And even the province has now enabled us to take a small portion of our funding and help education and awareness building on the natural environment and natural heritage and cultural heritage. And so these are all important values that I think many of us hold, and it doesn't come for free.
Fair enough. Thank you, everybody. If we want to move on to the next question, why doesn't the draft policy statement address the carrying capacities of the islands, as there are only so many people an island can support?
Yes, carrying capacity. Do you want to take that, Peter? Do you want? I know Delaney and David probably have comments on this too. Maybe if I can just like jump in with a couple of things. So anytime we have a word like carrying capacity, ecosystem management, like there's a number of different words that are kind of general philosophies of how we measure or how we understand something. We still have to get like very pragmatic about them at some point. And so most of the policies that are distributed across the policy statement are actually getting at the idea of carrying capacity in some way. They're asking communities to think about water and like that there's enough available and clean water, or that there is, you know, appropriate forest, contiguous forest. I don't actually know if that one got in there or not, but so like we're trying to make sure that we're actually thinking about what is, and then working that out locally in terms of what density is or what capacity is and how we're handling that. So maybe if you want to have a little more eloquent answer, Delaney and David might get it a more eloquent answer as I ramble on about it, but carrying capacity itself is actually a very vague term, basically. Delaney?
Yeah, I think you said it well, Trustee Morrison. I think it was proposed in an earlier draft of the draft new policy statement, and the trustees and committees really debated this term and how it would be implemented. And I think there was generally a feeling that really the freshwater sustainability is probably the prime kind of indicator for carrying capacity. And so the policy statement takes the approach of like within our jurisdiction, within our mandate, how can we look at like area-based approaches is one of the terms that is used, where we look at the whole island, look at both ecosystems and communities, the needs of both, and how do we make that work each island, and it looks different on each island. So it's difficult to come up with, there were concerns that it was difficult to come up with a specific calculation for the carrying capacity. And so that was removed by committees in the drafting process. But brought I would say that the concept was brought into many of the other policies.
And maybe just a shout out to the folks over on Galliano who are working on the, what is it, One Earth, One Island, or One Island, One Earth effort to actually try to quantify what carrying capacity looks like in the islands. Because that is, and like taking an island-based approach to what that looks like. So there is some amazing innovations going on in our own communities to really think this through carefully. And so, you know, hopefully we'll have a homegrown answer to this as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I believe that's the Galliano Conservancy Association that's championing that work, and I believe they're calling it the ecological footprint tool.
Yeah, or fingerprint, I think.
Fingerprint
Yeah.
tool.
Yeah.
So yeah, wonderful work.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in a little bit. You know, over the years, and indeed the 25 years since the policy statement was amended, language has changed a lot, and the issues have changed a lot. There are those within our community that think we've already exceeded the carrying capacity. And yet we haven't actually reached what has been the language we use within the Island Trust. We haven't reached build out, right? And that's a density that was determined a very long time ago that didn't take into account square foot of area that a home might cover, didn't take into account permeable surfaces, didn't take into account water consumption, or in fact, climate change and reductions in levels of water. And so I think, however, though, this carrying capacity, the concept, however you want to phrase it, sustainability, whether it's agriculture or community, it's part of the discussion all the time. And we, of course, as the land regulator, have to be careful about what it is we implement with respect to considering that maybe we have reached those capacities or what those capacities might be, because certainly when it comes to land interest, there are other points of view. We have to be open to hearing those points of view and learning from those points of view to determine how we can end up in a place where we have mutual respect and understanding about what that carrying capacity is and how it is we can cooperate with everybody in managing the human impacts in the Islands Trust area and on the planet, for it matters.
And I think I also want to put a bit of a twist on the question too. I know it wasn't intended this way, but I just can't help myself. I really have to also ask the question, because our responsibility is not actually solely to the humans in the Islands Trust area, is like carrying capacity for whom, right? For humans or for other organisms? What about the orca? What about that? So I think we need to really consider that, we're managing for many different values, not only for that human build out component. And so we really, really need to consider that when we're thinking about these complex, nuanced ideas of carrying capacity on the islands.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for jumping in on that one. Great question. Our next question is around private docks and sort of what led Trust Council to propose the directive policy of new private docks, especially when there are existing rules and regulations. There are studies of the area in place to evaluate the ability to acquire foreshore licenses. So I don't know if we want to speak to sort of what some of the intent behind that proposed amendment is.
I would turn to staff. Go ahead, go for it, Peter.
Well, this too is a difficult topic. I was a little surprised when it became obvious that a lot of people thought that there were too many docks. And in fact, I've been involved in conversations in local trust committees where communal docks is something that everybody would like to see happen. And in fact, government docks, and those of you that have been on the islands long enough know that we used to have government docks, but they divested themselves of docks because they were costly to maintain and manage, and indeed has ended up restricting access to people that are water only properties, or in situations where the ferry is difficult to catch or is overflowing and all these sorts of things. And actually, one of the things that people expect and enjoy is access to the water. And so a dock is an obvious thing. And in some places there appears to be lots of docks, and other places there appears to be none. And yet people still enjoy both of those places. So what we've become aware of over time is the impacts that docks have on the marine foreshore, and affecting eelgrass and species, and affecting harvesting sites of shellfish and the like, both for First Nations use, traditional uses, as well as other consumers. And so we have come to realize we need to turn our minds to how that is managed. And there was a strong point of view that there should be greater restrictions. And so it's a topic of serious consideration, not taken lightly.
Yeah, and if I may just jump in, the reference here to foreshore licenses, the province, in most areas of the trust, they have what they call general permissions. So if you meet certain requirements, such as it's a dock for personal use, and it's under a certain size, you don't need a license. But you have to obviously meet the zoning requirements in the area. So the onus really is on the local trust committees and the local governments to determine where docks are appropriate. And I was just going to say, as Chair Luckham said, that this actually came out of a discussion about the single docks that you see, and the intent is to cluster docks, to create more communal docks. It's not to say no docks absolutely, but to try and cluster them in a way that reduces their impacts on the environment.
Wonderful, lots of thoughts there. If nobody else wants to add anything, I think we'll jump to our next question, which is around growth. How will the new census data, along with current capacity to grow, be reflected in the policy statement to effectively inform further development decision-making in the trust area? That's a gooder.
Right. Well, my partner actually did the census on Saturna and Pender. So I think it's a really interesting question, because this question is coming from the perspective that there's sort of, consistent growth trajectory in the trust. And I think globally we're seeing that is a challenge, and for sure on the west coast of Canada, because we live in a beautiful place, and so people come here from other places that are not so beautiful, or that are already being heavily and harshly impacted in various ways by climate, but just by overpopulation. And so in terms of how it's reflected in the policy statement is the implementation of the Trust Act. It is actually just us trying to make sure that we're implementing our mandate. And so I don't know that I would say the census data itself would necessarily change that. How local trust committees are interpreting the trust policy statement, that's more likely to be impacted by the census data, because they're now managing both the trust policy statement and the local government act and the needs that they have inside that. So I think you're going to see most of those implications at the local trust committee level, not in the policy statement per se, but maybe I'm off on that.
So, the census data is interesting because it actually hasn't told us anything that we didn't already know.
Yeah, that's right.
On my road, half of the houses have changed ownership, but in some form or another, whether it's children have acquired it from the parents, or whether it's just simply changed hands to new people. I think almost all of the homes are now occupied full-time.
Mm-hmm.
When I moved here 35 years ago, there was a handful of us. There were lots of homes, but there was a handful of us that actually lived here full-time. And the populations have been growing. In fact, the pandemic has helped out very handily with that. because of the nature of the place, a safe haven, opportunity to work from home has changed people's lives. Dramatic increases in values of properties elsewhere in the province have allowed people to leave communities that they didn't want to be in and come to a community that they do want to be in with money in their pockets. So it's certainly changed and will continue to change. The pressures that come to bear from the surrounding urban areas on the little old Islands Trust area are significant and are probably as bad or worse than they were when the Islands Trust was created. And so what we do in a policy statement today to protect this for 2050, to vision out to 2050 is so important, because if we don't do this work now, when will we find time to do it? Because we're having difficulty keeping up with the applications for development that's happening already. And you look around in some of the more urban areas on Vancouver Island, for me, is the rate of growth that's happening in the towns and villages up and down the island is just significant, and there's spillover to the Gulf Islands. We will be taking it into account.
Wonderful, thanks everybody. Our next question. You guys had talked a little bit about some of the advocacy or coordination policies, and there's just a question around why is that something that the Islands Trust does? We've talked about it a little bit, but I thought we could maybe answer it a little more specifically head on.
Yeah, I'll start in on that. So this actually confused me a little bit when I first started in the Islands Trust. So, and I really want us to use the language of coordination because that's the language in the Act. So we're not necessarily, and there's some subtle differences there, but so basically we are here in the Islands Trust. There are layers upon layers of different government in this space at all different levels, and they have different jurisdictions. And that is incredibly confusing for me and also for our citizens generally. And so what we really need to do as part of the trust is we need to hold the mandate in the core and coordinate with all of these different levels of government to make sure that they are recognizing that the trust is a special management area related to its mandate, and that we are being respectful in how we're operating with all our different jurisdictions in relation to that mandate. And so we don't have control over lots of things in terms of direct trustees. Like I can't tell you right now that you can cut or not cut a tree generally like a municipality can. I can't necessarily say things about the shipping of a ship going by. There's a bunch of different stuff that we can't do necessarily, but that doesn't mean that we can't work to make it more effective between the province, the feds, First Nations, regional governments, to make sure that those things are smoother. International governments, like even down with the San Juans, because the ecosystem doesn't care that there's that many levels of government. And so we're trying to really do ecosystem level management, and that requires coordination with all levels of government. And I would argue too, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, that we're not actually only talking about coordination with levels of government. It's also coordination with community and making sure that we're not just informing community, but that we're also learning with and in community. So that we actually, because there's some great ideas out there already that we should maybe be pulling into policy. And so that's also part of coordination.
I couldn't tell who wanted to jump in there, Delaney or Luckham.
Speak first.
There's three really examples for me to draw upon about collaborating and coordinating with other orders of government, which is a very important thing that we do. Just Ministry of Highways, the roads. We have advocated historically for higher standards of roads, lower standards of roads. We've advocated for bicycle and pedestrian access on roads. We've advocated for public safety. On freighters, we want to make sure that people in Ottawa, people in the Port of Vancouver know that this is not an industrial area. And it's just simply a necessity, because not all orders of government are fully aware of what the Islands Trust area is and what's important about it. not only for the species that live here, human and mammals and animals and insects, but for the enjoyment of the residents of the area. This is a special place, and it requires special commitments by governments to maintain this special big place, because it could be lost in a moment, in a shipwreck, could be lost over time through degradation. And so advocacy is an important thing that we do, and we do it very selectively, sometimes less selectively, and we could be more deliberate on our advocacy, that's for sure. But if we have policy to guide us, then it can be clear to everybody what it is that we're doing in advocacy, in our role on delivering on the Preserve and Protect mandate.
And if I can just add, I think this is a really wonderful question. And in the earlier phases of the project, about a year ago, we published a discussion paper on the topic of the Islands Trust object. And during that process, we really delved into the history of the trust, the mandate, how even the trust came to be back in the 70s. And we saw in all of those early reports and meetings in the legislature that there was really a vision that the trust would play this role of like a co-coordinating body that would bring other agencies together from many different jurisdictions to coordinate for the purpose of carrying out the Islands Trust object. So you'll see, as you will have seen in the earlier presentation, the Islands Trust object enshrines that by saying that the object is to be carried out in cooperation with other levels of government. And it's also enshrined in sections 8 and 9 of the Islands Trust Act, as I mentioned earlier. So it's really seen to be the role of Islands Trust to advocate on behalf of the mandate. And there have always been advocacy policies in the policy statement since its very inception. So if you're interested in this topic, I'd really encourage you to have a look at that discussion paper. It's located in, it's posted in the project library folders on the Islands 2050 page at the very bottom of the page. And happy to answer any more questions you have on that topic.
So before we go to our next question, or as we go to our next question, this has gone very fast tonight, but we are closing in on the end of our time together. So I can definitively say now we aren't going to get to all of the questions that everybody has submitted before we finish our session tonight. And so I just wanted to remind everyone that we will be, we have them, they've been collected, we've documented them, and we will be preparing a question and answer document. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, I apologize for that, but we will get to it in writing and post it to the Islands 2050 webpage. And with that, if we want to switch to our next question. Is the Islands Trust giving itself new powers through the policy statement?
Yeah, I've heard this a lot, and it's always somewhat entertaining to me when people tell me, specifically not realizing who I am, all the things the trust policy statement is giving the trust. So no, the trust is not giving itself new powers. It can't do that because the trust policy statement actually has to be approved by the minister. So if we started to stray into areas that the province doesn't want us to do, that aren't within our scope, they would not approve the trust policy statement. So we're not writing a trust policy statement that can't be approved. Having said that, there is conversation among the trustees about which things need to be like fronted and organized in a way that is clearer and communicating very straightforward which are the coordinating policies and which are the directive policies. So that is a conversation that is going on. But no, the province, in the trust policy statement, the trust is not giving itself powers it doesn't have. It can't do that actually legally.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that one. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions here if we want to switch to the next slide. What method of reporting back is proposed, feedback loop, for keeping people informed about what is said and how it will be addressed? So there are two parts to that, what is said and how it will be addressed. So one of them happens once the phase 3 engagement ends, and that is the what was said. So ISL will prepare an engagement summary, and that will include questions that we've heard tonight. It will include results of the survey. It will include feedback that we hear through our other methods of engagement. And that will be a report on what is said. How it will be addressed will take a little more time, because Trust Council, as we've heard, is, needs to receive it, needs to receive other inputs from some of the things that we talked about earlier, like input from referral agencies, input from technical expertise, input from staff. And though all of those things will have to be considered. So there will be a lag in time between when we can share what was heard and when the Islands Trust will be able to share how it's been addressed. But I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that one.
I think that you've answered it. My expectations would be essentially that everything that has been recorded will be recorded and reported out in the way of a report. And themes will perhaps be identified by committees or trustees or staff where it seems appropriate. And then the decision-making process will proceed with what it is that we want to include or exclude from this particular revision of the policy statement. And then that will be on a public agenda in the future. All of this will be on a public agenda, and all the meetings will be on a public agenda. And so we will be reporting out in that fashion, the way that we do with our decision-making at the Islands Trust.
Okay, and for our last question of the evening, what does the new regional governance section in the draft amendments mean for local autonomy on islands? Sorry, I tripped over that. Panelists?
So the regional governance section is interesting because the naming and framing of it the way it is really, I think, caused a lot of people to feel like, oh, there's going to be a radical difference in how the trust is being governed. There isn't a radical difference in how the trust is being governed. But it is possible that some of the feedback we've had on language will change what how that section is framed. Because it is triggering people to think that suddenly it's going to be the Trust Council decides everything for local trust committees. And that just simply isn't true. It's not the way the trust is set up, and it's not the way local trust committees operate. Trust Council has always had the power to set directive policies, and it is in its mandate to set directive policies to ensure that the Trust Act is implemented. And that's what it's doing in the trust policy statement. So the regional governance section, it doesn't change the current local autonomy that we have. However, I think that there is some language there that is potentially needing revision, and clarity on what it is that's causing people to be very uncomfortable with that section is what is needed. So feedback that is very specific about what aspect of that is threatening local autonomy for folks, that's what needs to be stated. And then trustees can weigh in on that in the revisions as they go forward. Delana, did you want to add to that, or Peter? I know that this has come up a number of times in various feedback.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Delani.
I'm sorry.
Chime in if you don't answer it.
Okay, so I would I think you explained it really well, Chair Morrison, and I just want to read a paragraph from the preamble to the regional governance section, which is subtitled Regional and Localized Approaches. Underpinning the Islands Trust regional governance approach is a strong acknowledgement that a degree of local autonomy supports effective governance in the trust area. Each island within the trust area has unique characteristics and has developed in its own unique way over the years. While the preeminent duty of all locally elected officials is to uphold the Islands Trust object and regional mandate in all aspects of local planning and decision-making, they are to do so in a way that is sensitive and suitable to local circumstances and guided by open, consultative public participation. So that's very much the vision. And I think Trustee Morrison said the rest, and maybe Chair Luckham, you have something to add.
Yeah, you hit on an important aspect of the governance model that we operate under. Local autonomy is embedded in the legislation, which we are not going to be changing. And the Islands Trust has evolved over the 50 years, almost 50 years that we've been in place, where there was very little local autonomy at the beginning. And that autonomy has been enhanced over the years. And we want to continue to support that local autonomy, because indeed that's the ownership of the issues and the community and the culture in each and every community. And so we certainly do not intend to change that. It's what makes us vibrant, and it's what makes us creative, and indeed we share that, the joy of being able to work together and collaborate together for a collective interest.
And we, on Trust Council itself is not a unified group of people who think one way. We all argue with each other and learn from each other and learn from the differences across the islands. And that aspect of our differences also helps each of us take new things back to our islands and learn and grow too. So the local autonomy and the differences among us are actually a strength for the entire trust area.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, everybody at home. You asked some great questions tonight and that you submitted earlier. So there are a lot of questions, which is why we couldn't get through everything tonight. But I really want to thank you for your thought-provoking, thoughtful questions. This is really some of the key things that we have been hearing, and also some novel stuff tonight that we really wanted a chance to sort of address on a focused question by question basis. That said, we're going to have to wrap up tonight because we want to respect everybody's time. And I do want to mention, we have talked a little bit about some of the upcoming opportunities, and that upcoming opportunities, aside from the online survey, are a little more dialogue based. So there will be a virtual community workshop. It will happen not unlike this, except there will be more dialogue based as opposed to submitting of questions. That will be held over 2 evenings, March 15th and 22nd. The online survey will remain open between February 25th and April 17th. As we sort of nail down just what the rules are and comfort levels with having pick up and drop off traffic for community discussion guides, we'll be sharing information about specifics on how and where to pick up the community discussion guides, where the in-person community events and pop-ups will be. That will be coming to you shortly as we're able to nail down those details. So look to that information landing shortly on the webpage and through the various means that we mentioned. And that is everything that we have for you for this evening. I would really like to thank again everybody. And I don't know if panelists, if you would like to jump in. I think we've had some great questions tonight. I don't know if you had any closing thoughts before we wrap for the night.
Well, perhaps I'll start off and just thank everybody for participating, and appreciate that it might be a little bit longer than you were hoping for, and maybe the introduction might have been a little long and you were keen to ask questions, and indeed you were keen to sit in the room with us and have those discussions. And certainly we look forward to doing some of that as we move along, but just want to reflect on my own remarks this evening, that certainly I'm passionate about living here and wanting to support the Preserve and Protect mandate. But certainly out of that leaks my enthusiasm and my interest in particular areas. And what I really want you to know for sure is that we want to hear from you. I want to hear from you, because I want to be able to understand what the values are that you have, what's important to you that in your community, what it is that you're doing that may conflict with suggestions that others have made that are included in the policy statement, because together we need to understand each other's values, what's important, what's good about where you are and what's going on, and indeed what it is you'd like to see improved in other places. And it's through this dialogue that we will get to a much better place. And that's what I look forward to. I look forward to learning, and I enjoy finding out that I'm wrong about things, but I also enjoy finding out that I'm right about some things as well. But I and all the trustees are open to hear from you. And that's the most important message I can convey. Write to us, hit subscribe, send us an email, let us know what you're thinking so that we can build your thoughts into the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And I think I would add to that a couple things. Sometimes I feel like the harsher person. I feel, first of all, really big thank you to everybody to organize tonight, for all folks who came online in person and all those of you who will listen going forward. It is really important to be heard. So people sometimes think, oh, well, everything's going along fine. You know, I see preservation. We're hearing a lot of things from all different folks. And if you're not expressing that you like something, it may not make it into the trust policy statement. So you need to actually say what you like, what you don't like, why you like it, why you don't like it. So when those conversations come up in various revisions, your voice is considered. It's also important to understand that shouting loudly is not an effective method of public participation. And it will get people's emotions up and get people entrenched in particular stances. And that's not how many of us choose to live in community. We live in small communities where we have to get along with each other, even if we radically disagree with each other. So let's not get into entrenched shouting matches, and instead actually like have effective, deep communication efforts, really trying to understand and listen why somebody might disagree with you. And that stance hopefully will get us much further in the long run in protecting our communities and making them wonderful places to continue to live. So I think that would be the guidance I would give going forward, and just great appreciation for all of the thought that everyone's put in and the work that staff has done in terms of helping us get this far. Okay. I don't know if anybody else wants to throw in comments, but thank you again for being able to have this space.
Christy, you're muted, and maybe I'll just take the opportunity to also say thank you, and I would just echo all the comments that our trustees have made. I also want to just really underscore that this is just a draft, and we really do, everyone is very sincerely looking forward to hearing your feedback to improve this draft before it goes any further. So we're looking forward to the many engagement activities that ISL has planned, and I hope to meet you there. So thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. And now that I'm unmuted, I apologize. Glad that I was not able to cut you off, Delaney. Last time to say thank you to everybody. And we are going to leave you for the rest of your evening, and we'll see you soon at future events and activities. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Russ, I'm trying to get you back into as a panelist and I'm having some issues. Just bear with me 1 second.
It looks like he might just be on phone. Would that be an issue? I don't see a camera icon.
Might be, but he's back. He's now in the panelist group. So
Is he in the panelist group? Okay.
I'm seeing him there now. Yes. And I'm just going to, oh, this is weird. He's there, but he's not on my list.
We're still
Yeah.
recording as well.
I'm going to stop that right now.
Oh, I see Russ now.
Just give me 1 second here.
Sorry,